Susan Zirinsky, or Z as she's affectionately known, is the senior executive producer of the award-winning crime and justice series 48 Hours. But this powerhouse and highly respected journalist has worked in news since Watergate and is no stranger to war and conflict. In 1989, Zirinsky ran CBS News operations out of Panama during the United States invasion and was in charge of CBS News operations in Beijing during the Tiananmen Square student uprising and military crackdown. She was also on the front lines as the senior producer in Kuwait while covering the first Persian Gulf War and was part of the CBS News team and the first network to enter Kuwait just behind Allied forces. Her work and programs have earned virtually every major journalism honor, including multiple Emmy Awards, a George Foster Peabody Award, the Edward R. Murrow Award for Excellence, the Writer Guild of America Award, and the DuPont Award from Columbia University. In 2013, she was presented with the Lifetime Achievement Award by the New York Festival's International Film and Television Awards. Susan Zirinsky is a legend and a national treasure. It's such an honor to be able to sit down with her in New York and hear just some of her incredible stories.
I knew I couldn't go back.
You just put it out there.
She said you've got less than a year to live.
Just dug even
Luck
deeper.
is the residue of design.
Nobody else was doing it, so why couldn't I?
That was the turning point.
Welcome to the BUCKiT Podcast with Phil Keoghan. Every week I talk to mavericks, disruptors, and innovators. People who ditch the excuses, swerve off the predictable road, and epitomize what it means to tick it before you kick it.
It's the recorders of history that keep society going. They're the ones that tell you, do not forget what happened.
This is part 2 of my interview with the amazing Susan Zirinsky. Susan is just 19 and working in the newsroom with Walter Cronkite. Nixon had just resigned, and Cronkite is about to tell the nation.
So go back to the summer of August in 1970, and it is the night that Richard Nixon has resigned. And Cronkite is doing a special in the CBS Washington Bureau. And I was a production secretary, but pulled in to help with research. And I had done that a lot during the Watergate era because it was so intense, and I helped the researcher. And so I'm a script runner, and in those days the teleprompter was a machine where you would actually type on a specific typewriter that had big type, and then you would have this 7-ply copy that you would snap and pull, and one copy would go to the top copy to the anchor, second copy would be white, that goes to the prompter, salmon went to the director, green went to the audio guy, yellow went to the producer, color coded, and it was you could not give the wrong color to the wrong person or your hands would be chopped off. But after the show was over, and it was a moment in history. Nixon was out, Gerald Ford was in, and we were cleaning up, and Walter took the top copy of his script and he put it in the trash, and I saw it in the trash, and I pulled it out because it was just, it was the whole set. And I said, Walter, don't you want to take this back to New York for historic purposes? And he said, no. He said, they do transcripts in New York. And I said, oh, okay. So I took it out, and I walked back to my desk, and through fires and floods, I have held on to this script, which I probably could get an enormous amount of money on eBay for, but it is probably my most prized possession of a moment in history because it's Cronkite's own handwriting in correcting, right? And then it's top copy, and here it says Cronkite, and CLW was Charlie West, who was his writer at the time. And to have a copy like this that says, "Good evening. The 37th President of the United States resigned today. The 38th took office. It was an orderly succession, but with each occurrence an historic event, unparalleled in the 2 centuries the nation has existed. In departing, Richard Nixon spoke with intense emotion, and in arriving, so did Gerald Ford." And so this is his copy, and there's, I can hear him doing this copy, and in the end, it's kind of I like to feel it like if I was
It's
Helen
that
Keller,
tactile, yeah.
you know, because you can feel the pen mark. Like, just put your finger over the pen mark. You know, that's his pen, that's his handwriting, and you know it's and the last 2 pages. And so, virtually on the eve of her bicentennial, the United States has passed through a day of historic drama. ... A day many of her citizens had been awaiting with dread, a day some feared would shred the fabric of her society. But the feared has not come to pass. As President Ford said in his acceptance speech, our long national nightmare is over. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men. Here the people rule. Pause. It says, this is Walter Cronkite, CBS News, Washington. Good night. And that end was 35 seconds as timed out. And it's a beautifully written piece. This was his copy. And
how, Susan,
I mean,
it's so powerful to hear you.
It's an
say
exciting,
it and then see it.
Right. This was a moment in history. And I think as journalists, getting to be at moments of history and record them is kind of what, it's certainly not the money that keeps us here, because there isn't that. The money is less than if I was on Wall Street or a hedge fund. But I felt gifted in the sense of that somebody had gifted me a life, and I am grateful for every road trip, for every person I have met, for every experience, for every sleepless night. I just, who gets to do this? Who gets to have this? Like, who gets to hold Walter Cronkite's script from the night the 37th President of the United States, Richard Nixon, resigned? It was funny. I remember that night, and I felt kind of teary, and I was a little teary. And Cronkite looked at me at a commercial and he said, "Don't you dare. This is exactly what should have happened." And it wasn't about being a Republican or a Democrat. It was the kind of like moment of kind of traumatic event for the country. But Cronkite was all about, this is exactly what should happen. And that was what was in this copy. The government survived. It's not a government of men. It's a government of law.
Most prized possession?
Most prized possession. My child is probably my most prized possession, but this is a good second.
Where will it go to when you're long gone, Susan?
I don't know. I have there's a pollster named Frank Luntz who actually has a copy of the Oval Office built in his home in California, and he wanted to borrow this for a year, and he said, "I will return it," and I couldn't part with it. I can't
believe you brought it out, and I asked you to, and I'm so appreciative that you did, because realizing now the significance of it, I'm not sure I would have asked you.
It's in my desk, in the left to the
left. I know, but that's your desk, and
I know.
You brought it out here.
When Cronkite died, CBS was prepared, but we didn't really. All of a sudden, somebody said, "Hey, could you do a phoner with CNN or something?" And I'm literally in the evening news fishbowl and talking to people, and somebody else called and they said, "Oh, we just heard you on CNN. Could you come on and do this?"
Yeah.
And you talked about having this script. Do you have it? And I said, yes. So I literally, that whole weekend Cronkite died, I went all over town. And Sunday night around 10 o'clock, CBS called me, CBS Morning News, and they said, "Could you come on CBS?" I said, "Sure." They said, "Could you bring the script?" The Cronkite script? I said, "Sure." So I was the last on my own network, but you realize the impact that this man had.
And to that point, there's this fantastic quote from Lyndon Johnson who said,
"Oh, I know.
If we've lost Walter Cronkite, we've lost the war. We've lost the country."
This was when Cronkite went to Vietnam, and he came back, and they were doing a series of specials. And Cronkite, for the first time, and journalists, especially in those days when there wasn't channels of opinion, question the efficacy of the war, and in such a way that it really pulled into doubt whether we should be there and what was the purpose of it. And that quote was very famous. It was disputed at some point did he really say it, but the Cronkite report from that documentary and that CBS special on Vietnam held no punches, and it did question the reality of being in that war and could there be any winners in that war. And that was a tough place to be.
Will there be another person, man or woman, who will have that kind of power in their voice?
There will never be another voice that holds the country in their hands at moments of crisis. There won't be a broadcaster, a journalist. I think that we look to our political leaders to do that, and even that is a little difficult to see at this point. The world has so many factions that the purity of just being there for the country is absent, I think, and it's why I think there is so much fractured feelings among people, and not really feeling one person stands above all else. And that's why Cronkite held this incredible position, because he was apolitical, he was agnostic. And
to a fault?
No, in that era, and I think the Vietnam doc was one of the first pieces where you kind of felt his feeling of what he had seen, that he couldn't just give the report and let the viewer decide. He crystallized the debate, and I think that's what set that report apart.
Is that what's missing today, chronically?
Well, I think today there are so few objective voices that that today there's far fewer objective voices, and that's what's kind of missing.
Is there a place you can? Can you point us to any objective?
Yeah, I
voices?
think CBS works hard at being objective, and it was interesting the night of the election that Donald Trump won in a surprising victory, even surprising to himself and his own pollsters, who that night predicted he would not win. I think that the voices now at that night, there was a kind of shrillness. The tonality of the voices was sort of shocked and almost took on a fearful aspect, because it was such a shocking. People were shocked by the victory, and I think that we've become conscious of how you sound, especially when it's an unusual experience to have the White House attacking the press as viciously as it is. Whether, the White House has always been the enemy of the press in a funny way.
Right.
The press has not always been the enemy of the people.
Right.
I can remember being a kid in the Washington control room during Watergate, where the White House press office would call the control room to talk to somebody, to complain about the story that wasn't even on the air in Washington. It was on in Baltimore at 6:30 and Washington at 7. They would be complaining about the story before it was airing, and So I think that as journalists, we are human beings. We are human beings, but you have to leave your human side and just take it and report it and
Which is
be
difficult.
Factual. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
I don't know. The Nixon enemies list looks more friendly these days than ever before. It's just we're at a critical juncture of journalism, of holding on and really knowing that the import of the objectivity and facts and truthfulness is just where you have to go.
Must be challenging at times when you feel you have the information, but you can't be absolutely sure, and you've got to hold off until you've got absolute confirmation.
Absolutely. I'd rather be second than wrong. A lot of times you must get a second source to report information. And I remember that during Watergate. That's where I learned that rule. I think the hardest part is the playing field, which is not level between the White House and the press. And it's very difficult to be held up to ridicule when you know that you are reporting factual incidents, facts, historical references. If you feel like you're in
the Twilight Zone.
Twilight Zone, yep. And I think you just have to hold on to it and just keep moving forward and just understand
eventually
that
the truth will prevail.
History will right the ship, whichever way it goes.
Yeah. Susan, you've talked about how far you've traveled in your career. You've been all over the world. And then perhaps the most impactful news story in American history in the last 100 years happens 30 blocks from your office.
I felt like I had trained my whole life. I've said this, my whole life to cover 9/11.
In what way?
Because I always got on an airplane. Home was the safe place. We were kind of, I don't know, we were in the safety zone. It didn't happen here. It proved a vulnerability that you reported on all over the world. We're not vulnerable. We're the United States of America. It's like when I went into Russia and I'm in Moscow and I wrote back, I've seen the enemy. We should not be afraid.
Right.
It's just, it was so stark. It was such a wake-up call, I think, not only to journalists who felt a sense of guilt of having not found the holes in the hate against this country as deep as they were. And I remember the first 60 Minutes and 48 Hours alternated each night in prime time, being responsible for broadcasting. But I remember after the second night, I walked down to the site, to the towers, and I had press credentials, but they weren't really letting people in. And I said, I lied. I said, I'm meeting Dan Rather, who's going to interview Mayor Giuliani. And so they let me through, and I kind of just, I didn't really have a job down there. I just wanted to go down and take it in. And when we got to do the documentary, 9/11, with the French filmmakers and James Hanlon, the firefighter partner, I felt actually grateful to be able to do something that would become an important record of history. And Robert De Niro ended up being the host of it because he was so ingrained in downtown. And I remember shooting the on cameras, and we were shooting all over the city, and we were supposed to get down to Ground Zero at about 11 o'clock midnight, and the people were waiting for us there, and we didn't really get down there till like 4 a.m, and everybody waited. And we shot on top of Ten House, which was a small firehouse that really was just adjacent to the Twin Towers. And then they wanted to take Bob down. They presented Bob with an Iron Cross. So this was in March. Just probably at the end of February. We were shooting just days before the documentary would air, and there was that giant piece of metal that kind of formed a cross. Yeah. And they took a piece of it and they made a cross for Bob, and they made a smaller cross for me, and I have it on my desk at home. I look at it every day. But they wanted to take Bob down into the Ground Zero, and it was still everything was still being pulled out. And they wanted me to come along, and I couldn't. I just couldn't go down there because I felt like there were the ashes of all these people. And I was wearing running shoes that night, and I took them off, and they hang out behind my door, and I've never worn them again because I felt like there were ashes on my feet, and I didn't want to wash them away. and I didn't want to put them on again. So I just have they're hanging on the hook behind my door. And James Hanlon, the firefighter who's part of the team, on the 10th anniversary, gave me a piece of one of their fire trucks had been destroyed, and they had pieces of it, and he gave me a piece of it, and I have it, and it's framed, and it's like, I think that's one of the things that I value of what I have gotten to do, which is I'm not part of history, I'm an observer of history, but I realize that from the Bible to now, it's the recorders of history that keep society going, and they are the ones that bring the lessons, and they're the ones that tell you, do not forget what happened. You cannot forget. And I have things that I remember like a minute ago. And most people walking on the planet don't get to do this, and so I've thought it a privilege. I've taken pay cuts, voluntary pay cuts occasionally, and I can't believe how old I am. I can't believe
well, you don't
that
look old. You really, you seriously. I don't know if you've had plastic surgery, but you look very young. And you have
I think it's because I'm short.
Young.
Yes, I'm definitely. I once had a guy. Actually, I was living in Washington, and I came back. I had gone for a run, and he was having a cup of coffee, and he sat down and he said, "I really like you, but this isn't going to work." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "You're exhausting to me." And I said, "You're breaking up with me because I'm too energetic." He goes, "Yep." Yep. He said, I don't think I can keep up.
You must have a special husband then.
No, he just goes to bed. He's just, I exhaust him, but my dogs are kind of curious. But, I just, like when you do interviews like this or I give a speech, I really stop and I think, oh my God, but I really can't believe I'm as old as I am.
You're a living legend.
A legend in my own mind. But
you are. I mean, it's so cool. All the things that you've done, and it's an inspiration for other storytellers, I think.
I feel grateful.
And also, I feel for people who are lucky enough to do what we do in terms of telling stories, just to see that you can have a career like yours, more than 4 decades, and still have that zest for the story and that drive for the story, which takes us back to the time that you got Dan Rather off a plane and you said, I have an idea. And so you get him off the plane and he says, you better not
know what the fuck you're doing.
Yeah. And so
we
if Zirinsky can convince anchor Dan Rather to drive in a military convoy in the dark with landmines all around them, they will be the first, just behind Allied forces, and arrive before anyone else to anchor the news from inside the city. It's a big risk, but once again, Zirinsky is prepared to take it.
Within 30 minutes, we were in some Saudi motorcade. Again, I couldn't drive. Dan was in a vehicle earlier on with the sat phones and everything else, and I was in a car. I think I got somebody from the BBC to drive my car, and unfortunately, we're driving into Kuwait, where the Iraqis had already left, and crazy, but we got separated from the Saudi motorcade. There were 2 or 3 vehicles that had become separated because it was daylight on the clock, but in reality, it was pitch black because of the oil fires.
The oil, yeah.
So we kind of got out of the car, and we're walking the vehicles the last 20 miles, and there were tanks and bodies and the smell, and it was pretty gaggable. And I thought, and I have no satellite phone with me, I thought, not a particularly good career move to lose the anchor in a war zone.
No.
And so we
of
just
that stature.
kept driving, and eventually it was like, I thought I'd either died because I saw a great big white light And I turned to the people in my vehicle. I said, I've either died, we've all died, or that's a television light, and let's head toward the light. So we were like moths. We head toward the light. And my crew was brilliant. They had set up the satellite. New York was seeing us, and I had a manual little typewriter. I was very smart that on the way to Dhahran, I knew there'd be no power. So I bought 4 old manual Olivettis at the airport because they still sold those little portable typewriters. Believe me, the New York
Smart
Times.
move.
I could have rented them out.
I'm going to make a note of that. That's a good one.
Oh yeah. I bought those. I still have them. I have them all. They're under my couch in my office. And I started. They said we want to anchor everything from there. And Dan's we set up in a restaurant called Shrimpies on the Corniche, on the water, and where the Iraqis had been like hours before. And there were these boxes and boxes, and somebody pried one open, and they were surface to air missiles that they just like got the hell out of town.
God.
There were tuna fish cans, like kind of warm candles that still looked like the wax was on them. So we anchored the evening news from Shrimpies that night, and I thought, glad I made it. Like, he would have been fine without me because there were plenty of people, but our texts were amazing. They said, yeah, we got a signal into New York. The sat phones are up. So I get in there and I just start typing copy and,
You knew what the fuck you were doing.
Well, I was lucky. I don't know that I was that smart. I was lucky that night at Shrimpies. Yes, one
you
of
make
my...
your own luck, Susan.
Yeah, you do make your own luck.
You make your own luck.
My other favorite souvenir is actually... a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, which I brought back from the first Gulf War into this country. It was kind of...
You did what?
I brought an RPG back because...
How did you know it was safe to bring back?
Well, because it was just the weapon. It wasn't loaded.
All right, Susan. I was going to say.
Yeah. Well, there was a South African cameraman named Chris Everson, and we went up in a helicopter, and we were taking pictures of the Highway of Death. And we landed the chopper because nobody really knew. That's when the Iraqis were heading back towards Baghdad, and it was kind of crazy because they had dumped all their weapons because they were bringing stereos and curling irons back and all these kind of things, and it was pretty funny. So we kind of grabbed a fair amount of weapons, and when we got back to Dhahran, some people had been bringing live munitions and live grenades, so they were checking everybody's equipment. I happened to be traveling with like 200 pieces of gear because I was carrying the gear of the crew that was still prisoner in Baghdad. So the guy finds me and he opens up, and I had disassembled the RPG, so it was in pieces. So he brings this tube and he brings me up to the joint information. It was called the JIB. And the colonel, who I had not seen since we left for Kuwait, congratulated me on getting into Kuwait first. And I said, well, but I screwed the entire military pool. He goes, a win is a win. So I said, it's just the tube. I didn't tell him I had the rest of the gun. And he said, well, what else do you have? I said, why? He said, well, what else do you have? I said, what do you want? And he said, do you have any AK-47s? I said, yeah.
Maybe.
You want one? I gave him 2 AK-47s, and I kept the RPG, which sits in my living room by my fireplace, as my husband says, like we really need a conversation piece.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things I love about you is that you refuse to say no to things, and
oh yes, that's my favorite saying.
And I love this quote from you. Say, no is hello. No is the beginning of any conversation. I get raw energy from negativity. It's like the Iron Man challenge for me. If I work hard enough, I can inspire the people working with me. I can turn that no into a yes.
That's how I feel. I mean, you just feel like, can't you just convince somebody to do something that it's in their best interests? 99% of the time you can.
Yeah.
You can.
Yeah, you have that ability.
Yeah. No,
to turn it around. You could say no. You could say no to me 50 times. I'm still going to call you on Monday with an idea. Yeah,
well, no. Or somebody comes to you with a terrible idea and you don't want to react immediately. And I have what I call my VNE, my value neutral expression. So somebody comes in, the idea is hateful. And you just kind of say, I have never thought of that before. That's really, I don't know, that's really interesting. I need to think about that.
All right,
They
if
walk
I come
away.
to you with an idea and I see that,
Yeah.
I know what's
react.
going on.
I'm like a blind date. I mean, my favorite No is Hello story was actually in Russia with Boris Yeltsin, and we were doing a documentary called 7 Days in May, and Diane Sawyer was working at CBS in those days, and she was the whole purpose was to get Yeltsin to say yes to do an interview, and like we were getting nothing, and it was in the Kremlin. It was this gigantic office. It was just gorgeous. And then he's was kind of a little bit of an alcoholic, a little lustful kind of guy.
Bit, yeah, I heard he liked to drink.
Lot. And so I go in my backpack and I pull out this very sexy picture of Diane, and I walk to his desk and I slam it on his desk and I said, "That's who's going to do the interview." And the guy, he starts to flush and he looks and he goes like, "I've been there like more than an hour," and he says, "Oh, конечно," means certainly. He goes, "Конечно. Da, interview." I go, "Oh shit! Why didn't I come with the picture on my like taped to my sweater?"
Would have been so much easier.
Yeah, right.
Would have got you there. Have you ever thought about being on camera? I mean, you're so telegenic.
I never ever thought about the role in front of the camera. However, it was very interesting. I ended up. I do stuff on camera.
Yeah.
I promote the show.
You're
go
interactive on
I'm
Twitter.
I'm all of that.
You are an extrovert.
I am. I'm an introverted extrovert. I do like walking into a room and like kind of feeling like cool, not cool, but like excited by the room.
Well, you do light up a room. I've been in rooms.
Wait, don't say that, because we say that about everybody who was murdered on my show.
Oh, okay.
They could light up a room. There was a couple of times I did something with the affiliates, like one of those affiliate kind of blitz projects, and I can't even remember what it was for. And somebody called me and they said, did you ever think about like doing hosting and stuff? I said, absolutely not. But I really enjoy being on television. Like I could feel it.
It's your story sense. You're very good at structuring the story, getting that beginning, middle, and end to the story, which is so crucial.
It was funny. It wasn't until that one round robin, that satellite tour, that somebody came down and they said, "Wow, that was like your energy kind of jumps through the screen." And I said, "Is that good or bad?"
Susan, I really appreciate you sharing so many of your stories, and generally end with a few questions. 2 questions. First one, if you could take a road trip with anybody, dead or alive, and you could have 3 companions in the car with you, who would you take with you?
That's an awesome question. I think if I could take a road trip, I would want Nelson Mandela driving.
Okay.
And I would want in the car Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. Modern leaders of terror, with a man who fought his whole life for peace and succeeded.
Is that why you put him in the driver's seat?
Yes.
And where are you sitting? In the front or the back?
I'm in the back between Gaddafi and Saddam.
Ah. What a trip. Man.
Wonder who'd bring the dates and the fruit.
And then your last day on Earth, Susan, if you could design your last day any way you wanted.
Wow. Well, there's a clause though. I'd have to find out. I'd have to know ahead of time. Is there heaven?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
If there was no heaven, I would want my family around me and want to know that they were okay with how I lived my life. and that things I maybe didn't do that they understood, but they knew that I was doing the best I could at that moment.
Wonderful.
That could be a cryable question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, some people get faced with that, and yeah, it's an interesting one. Makes you think about what's really important, I guess. Thank you.
My small cold hands, right?
Yeah. You can watch this podcast online at philkogan.com. And let me know what's on your bucket list. You never know. You might be my next guest. Don't forget, tick it before you kick it.